Hi Tania, to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how your background has prompted your foray into videography?
Hey everyone, and firstly, thanks so much for having me. I guess my family's background firstly is quite mixed. We're Arabic, but have recently found out our family tree somewhat. But the nuts and bolt of my immediate story is that I was born here in Sydney. My two brothers were born in Lebanon during the war. My dad was born in Tripoli. They have countless stories of escaping war zones and, bombs being fired off into their homes and caught in their roofs and not exploding, leaving so many homes one after the other, leaving everything behind. Eventually, they found the resources and support to leave. So they left in the mid-80s and I was born in 88. Completely different upbringing, but ironically, it's meant that I now in my early 30s have a very strong connection to my culture, and it's actually the catalyst to what started my career as a storyteller, because when I turned about 21, I decided it was time to really reconnect with being Lebanese. I had previously almost denounced my culture. There was a lot of racism growing up in Australia, so I was anything but Lebanese. We had, of course, 9/11 really impacted schools here and bullying. It was bad to be Arabic. So in my early 20s, when I kind of came into that sense of pride, I just suddenly packed up and left. And very unfortunately, a few days into my trip living in Trablos, Tripoli, with my grandmother at the time, a civil conflict broke out. So that was my first experience with war. Hearing shelling and bombing all night for months on end. The only thing that I could do during curfew was draw, and I thought that those drawings eventually would culminate and turn into a graphic novel so that I could tell the story back home. I hadn't seen a story like this, not only what it's like to experience war, albeit civil and small, comparatively, but also for, I guess, the diaspora as a queer Australian Arabic, quite androgynous looking woman experiencing war in a very different kind of part of the world. When I got back to Sydney, I realized a graphic novel was a little bit too niche and that video was the way. So I turned it into an animation, took 9 months, and it ended up winning first place at the United Nations Plural Plus Film Festival. And they sent me over to New York. So that was really the first time I'd created a visual story, saw it in the theatre, saw it being received really well. And I thought, okay, this is the most accessible way of getting a story out there.
So we know that you used to be on BuzzFeed. Could you share a little bit about how your experiences there guided you in your journey?
Yeah, so I started off in BuzzFeed in 2015 in Sydney, and I spent about a year with the company here. Then they ended up relocating me to Los Angeles. To be honest, I feel quite conflicted about it now. BuzzFeed is a conglomerate, they're massive. They're a news and entertainment company. My heart is more in the news and documentary style format, but I realized as well that there was some kind of essence in producing, really for the first time in my career, that producing slightly less intense stories sometimes are a bit of a reprieve. I think for people who live and breathe politics and live and breathe what is happening in the world, it is hard to disconnect from that. So I saw that BuzzFeed had a place for that, but ultimately it wasn't fulfilling. So it was hard to balance the two, to be quite honest. It was hard to find my passion and my purpose in that role. And of course then to be met by so much online, the public world on online media. As we know, social media can be really grueling. You could make a video about foster kittens and puppies and someone would still have an issue with it. And they do, and they'll let you know. And I think it's hard, especially when you're younger, to not take that on. So it was the constant balance of okay, this company isn't all that it's cracked up to be quite blunt, but they have a really big platform, and the documentary stories that I was able to tell using their platform hit a reach beyond any other means that I could have garnered elsewhere. That was what kept me going. That's what still kind of provides that feeling of I did the right thing.
Having developed a successful career as a video journalist, what prompted you to move to Lebanon?
Yeah, okay, so after LA, I was there for a couple of years, and when I couldn't take it anymore, I moved over to London, and I was there for about a year. But for 6 months of that, I was in pre-production for my documentary series, Shway Shway, which translates to little by little, or slowly, slowly in Arabic. And the whole concept behind it was to feature change makers in Lebanon. The reason being, I hadn't seen it elsewhere. I had accrued this platform on social media because of my career in BuzzFeed, which I couldn't completely understand. But rather than post, teeth whitening ads, which I get a ridiculous amount of requests to do, I wanted to instead feature NGOs and people who are on the ground in this tiny dot of a country that is doing so much for the environment, for LGBT plus rights, for animal rights, for refugees. They have the highest refugee population per capita in Lebanon, even though it is literally minuscule comparatively to, say, Australia, where I am, which has endless resources and wealth and land and space and is on stolen land. So packed my bags a year after London and moved back to Lebanon, and I was living in Beirut, which is their main city, very built up, and there are some parts that are war-torn, other parts where they have the biggest clubs in the world, to Bekaa Valley, which is almost entirely refugee camps in certain sections, to North Akkar, Trablos. And I featured NGOs that were making sustainable pads for girls and women living in refugee settlements and providing free sex and health education. I put down the camera even and volunteered in Bekaa just to help out with kids there who are dealing with a lot of PTSD and hadn't been to school maybe their entire lives, even though they were, between the ages of 5 and 8. I think the reason I was there, if you had to put it down to anything, was just because it was right. Me having grown up in the very cushion bubble kind of environment where I am, I had the passport, I had the resources, I had the skills to be able to actually offer something of value, to take a camera and create a short documentary on these people and NGOs who are doing 110% with nothing, just to raise awareness and spread it to people, is huge. I mean, everyone I met just didn't quite understand why I was there. They were really happy, but they all said, why leave Sydney to be here, or why leave London to be here? And honestly, if I had it any other way, I'd be there right now. 100 times over, particularly after the Beirut explosion.
So could you elaborate a bit on how your work was received at home and your experiences in Lebanon?
Yeah, so the fact that I've gone back to Lebanon now twice as an adult, I went many times as a kid with my family, but twice as an adult is seen as a little bit incomprehensible to a majority of my family. Again, though, that is coming from a place of trauma and PTSD. Their memories they have really good memories before the war, but I think when they remember, I'm this tattoo-clad, short-haired, gay woman walking through Beirut, and it's hard for them, I guess, to feel like I'll be safe. But again, Beirut is a major city. The LGBT plus community there is thriving. A lot of change needs to be made and still is very much on its way toward a place of peace and safety. But the community there are very, very proud. I mean, I did a documentary on these two trans best friends who are just absolutely beautiful. The drag shows there are next level. Honestly, the parties and nightlife is something that is not comparable even to Europe, where I've had the privilege of also traveling to. So I think Lebanon has come a long way, and for my family maybe who hasn't been there in a long time, they were coming from a place of fear when they said that, so I can understand that. For others, again, with the online following that I have through BuzzFeed, a lot of comments from friends and strangers was that my actions of going there to do this not-for-profit documentary series that was self-funded, they saw that as brave and courageous. I found that really interesting. I could understand again, but also I think there's a big difference between doing something that's right to being brave. It's like those YouTube videos where people go and give, $20 to a homeless person, and someone's filming from the bush to see what they'll do, and when the homeless person shares that money, it's this groundbreaking act of kindness. I think that isn't the right intention. We should be doing things for others just because they're for others. Journalism is exhaustive. It's also dangerous. You land yourself in very precarious situations. One of the documentaries I did was in Shatila refugee camp, which is notoriously unsafe. There's a lot of gun violence there. Very rare for a camera to be allowed in, but I was allowed through a Palestinian elder who was born in the camp post the 1948 Nakba. She was actually born there in her 60s now, and she took me through and allowed me to film, and I did absolutely have a sense of fear at the time. Similarly to me filming in India across red light districts, when I did a documentary for the Freedom Fund on child slavery and human trafficking. There is a certain need for, I guess, acknowledgement in a way when you work in this field. But that for me comes through people just watching it and sharing it, not to say that it was good of me or brave of me.
And our final question for you. What do you think limits people from pursuing work considered more meaningful? And how would you encourage them to do so?
It's an interesting question to think about what limits people, but I think it's mostly fear. And again, I'm talking to people who have the resources. And by that, I mean a passport, a bit of money in the bank, the freedom to leave, maybe they're of an age where they're not living in home anymore. People are afraid to lose the comfort that they know. A lot of the time, even to this day, people ask me on Instagram, what can I do? How can I make this world a better place? I think collectively we share that sense of helplessness, particularly after 2020. But if anything, it should serve as the biggest reminder of how connected we all are and how we are all the same. And if this were to happen to you or me or them across the seas, I don't see a difference in that. And it's funny that comfort can be so addictive. For me, I find comfort in challenges. I find comfort in being thrown into the deep end. When I'm too comfortable in Sydney, I know that something's wrong. It's not enjoyable to kind of sit around and go through Groundhog Day. And ironically, I think a lot of people could agree, and that's why people need respite from their sometimes very privileged lives that are going pretty well. When you just pick up and leave, and sometimes it doesn't take this, okay, but take the example of volunteering in Lebanon, in Bekaa Valley. I lived in a refugee house there. There was a volunteer home, essentially, that was right near the settlements, and there were people from all over the world. And some people were there with the mindset of volunteerism. They were there for a couple of weeks, and it was, I guess, to experience something and then go back home. Other people were there for months. Some of them were supposed to be there for 3 months, and they're still there today. So that's almost a year and a half afterward. I think, look at your intent. If your intent is right and it's not to take a selfie in a settlement, if you're going to work with an NGO, and it just takes a tiny bit of research, they're all out there. It's actually wild how many websites will connect you with people who need help around the world. You just need to Google it. But yeah, I mean, if you're there with the intent of a brief moment of purpose and finding some kind of selflessness in that act, then that's probably not the right thing, and maybe you should donate instead to people who are actually on the ground and really there to just help, you know. And of course there's a degree of satisfaction from that, but ultimately, you know, my theory is that it's better to be doing something than to just be sitting at home and judging others for it.
Thank you so much, Tania, for sharing your experiences. We're extremely grateful for having been able to host you at TEDx this year.
Thanks so much again. And honestly, you know, for those who are, when the world hopefully gets to a better, calmer place soon, for those who are really looking to go out into the world and be on the ground to help, again, say with the Beirut explosion, they need so many hands on deck right now. I actually applied to leave. I applied for an exemption from Australia and it was denied. Unfortunately, we are unable to leave Australia to this day because of COVID-19. But for those who want to and who are able and in a position to do so, just do it and book way longer than you think. Ultimately, it's going to be a fraction of your life comparatively, and changing the life of one person is enough. It's monumental, you know, but one person can have that ripple effect on an entire community. And I think for the diaspora as well, which, you know, I hope some of you are watching right now, I understand that guilt and that confusion and the pull to a culture, and maybe that will come later in your life if you're quite young at this point, but listen to it, give in and be there. Thank you.